You call yourself a pastor, but hid behind scripture to commit murder. Samuel Brooks, the court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
On the warm Tuesday evening of September 3, 1996, in Macon, Georgia, the Emergency Dispatch Center received a frantic call at 9:47 p.m. The voice on the other end belonged to Pastor Raymond Holt, a well-known spiritual leader in the community, his words tumbling out in what sounded like panic and despair. "My wife, she's collapsed. She's not breathing right. Please, you have to send someone now." The dispatcher, maintaining her professional calm, asked for the address and details. Raymond provided his home address on Magnolia Lane, a quiet tree-lined street in one of Macon's established neighborhoods. He described his wife Miriam as having fallen to the kitchen floor, gasping for air, her lips turning blue. "How long has she been like this?" the dispatcher asked. "I don't know, minutes? Maybe longer? I was in my study and I heard a crash. Please just send help." "Sir, help is on the way. I need you to stay calm." "Is she conscious?" "Barely. Her eyes are open but she's not responding to me. She's making these terrible sounds like she can't get air." "Okay, I'm going to stay on the line with you until the paramedics arrive. Can you check if she has a pulse?" There was a pause, the sound of movement, then Raymond's voice again, shaking. "I think so. It's weak. Very weak. Oh God, please don't let her die. Please." Emergency medical responders arrived at the Holt residence at 9:54 p.m., 7 minutes after the call. They found Raymond standing on the front porch, still holding the cordless phone, his face pale, his hands trembling. He gestured frantically toward the house. "In the kitchen. Please hurry." Paramedics rushed inside, their equipment bags in hand. The house was immaculate, hardwood floors polished to a shine, religious artwork on the walls, everything in perfect order. But in the kitchen, lying on the tile floor in a spreading pool of her own vomit, was Miriam Holt. She was 51 years old, a small woman with graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a modest floral dress and an apron. Her eyes were half open, her breathing shallow and labored. Foam flecked her lips. The lead paramedic, James Morrison, immediately began assessment while his partner started oxygen. Miriam's vital signs were critical, her heart rate erratic, blood pressure dangerously low, pupils dilated and unresponsive. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Morrison asked, checking her airway. "Mrs. Holt." No response except a weak gurgling sound. "How long has she been like this?" Morrison asked Raymond, who hovered in the doorway. "I don't know exactly. Maybe 10 minutes? 15? I was working in my study and I heard a loud crash. When I came in, she was on the floor like this." "Has she been sick? Any complaints of illness?" "She's been feeling poorly all week. Tired, nauseous. I thought it was just a flu." "Any known medical conditions? Allergies? Medications?" "No, nothing. She's always been healthy. She never even takes aspirin." Morrison and his partner worked quickly, trying to stabilize Miriam enough for transport. But her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her breathing became more labored, her pulse weaker. "We need to move now," Morrison said. "Let's get her to the rig." They loaded Miriam onto the stretcher and rushed her to the ambulance. Raymond followed, climbing into the back to ride with his wife. As they pulled away, sirens wailing, he held Miriam's hand and prayed aloud, his voice breaking. "Father God, please spare her. Please don't take her from me. She's everything to me. Everything." At Macon Regional Hospital, the emergency room staff took over. Dr. Sarah Chin, the attending physician, quickly assessed Miriam and ordered a battery of tests. But despite aggressive intervention, 4 fluids, medications to stabilize her heart, respiratory support, Miriam's condition continued to crash. At 10:32 p.m., less than an hour after the 911 call, Miriam Holt was pronounced dead. Dr. Chin emerged from the trauma room to find Raymond sitting in the waiting area, his head in his hands. When she approached, he looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Holt," Dr. Chin said gently. "We did everything we could, but your wife didn't respond to treatment. She's gone." Raymond's face crumpled. He made a sound, half sob, half moan, and buried his face in his hands again. No, this can't be happening. Not Miriam. Not my Miriam." Dr. Chin sat down beside him, giving him a moment before asking the necessary questions. "Mr. Holt, I need to understand what happened. You said your wife had been feeling ill?" Raymond nodded, wiping his eyes. "For about a week. Maybe longer. She was tired, complained of stomach pain, headaches. She threw up a few times. I told her to rest, to take it easy, but you know how women are. She kept pushing herself, kept trying to do everything. Did she see a doctor? No. She hated doctors, always said they made too much fuss. She believed in prayer and rest. He looked at Dr. Chen with genuine confusion. What happened to her? How could she just die like this? That's what we need to determine. Her symptoms and the speed of her decline suggest some kind of toxic exposure or acute organ failure. We'll need to perform an autopsy. Raymond flinched at the word. An autopsy? You mean cut her open? No, I can't allow that. Our faith. I understand this is difficult, but Georgia law requires an autopsy when someone dies suddenly without a clear medical explanation. We need to know what caused your wife's death. But she was sick. I told you she had the flu or something. Mr. Holt, this wasn't the flu. Your wife's presentation suggested something far more serious. The autopsy will give us answers and help protect others if there's an environmental toxin or contagious illness involved. Raymond seemed to deflate. Fine. Do what you have to do. I just want to know why she's gone. Before we continue with this devastating story of betrayal, manipulation, and a slow, calculated murder, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below. Cases like this reveal how evil can hide behind a mask of righteousness, and your engagement helps us continue sharing these important stories. Now, let's go back to that September night and uncover the truth about what really happened to Miriam Holt. The news of Miriam Holt's death spread quickly through the congregation of Grace Covenant Church, where Raymond had served as senior pastor for 18 years. By Wednesday morning, the church was filled with shocked and grieving members, gathering for an impromptu prayer service. Raymond stood at the pulpit, looking haggard but composed, and addressed the crowd of nearly 200 people. My brothers and sisters, he began, his voice thick with emotion, I come before you today with a broken heart. The Lord has called my beloved wife Miriam home. She left us suddenly last night, taken by an illness we didn't fully understand. I am devastated. We were married for 24 years. She was my partner, my helpmate, the woman who stood by my side through every trial and triumph. He paused, seeming to gather himself. Several women in the front rows were already crying. Miriam was the embodiment of a godly wife. Submissive, devoted, hardworking. She never complained, never questioned, never failed in her duties as a wife and as a servant of this church. She ran our Bible studies, organized our fellowship meals, counseled young women on marriage and faith. She was everything a Christian woman should be. Someone in the back called out, Amen. I know many of you are asking why. Why would God take someone so faithful, so dedicated? I don't have an answer except to say that God's ways are not our ways. His timing is not our timing. Perhaps Miriam's work here was complete. Perhaps the Lord needed her more than we did. More amens, more tears. Raymond's friend and fellow pastor, Marcus Webb from the neighboring Baptist church, stood and came to put a hand on Raymond's shoulder in support. We'll get through this together, brother, Marcus said. The whole community is here for you. But while the church mourned publicly in a quiet office at Macon Regional Hospital, Dr. Chen was reviewing the preliminary findings from Miriam's blood work with growing concern. She'd ordered a full toxicology panel as a matter of protocol, and the initial results were troubling. Miriam's blood showed elevated levels of calcium oxalate crystals, a telltale sign of ethylene glycol poisoning. Antifreeze. Dr. Chen immediately called the medical examiner's office. I need to speak to Dr. Patterson. It's urgent. Dr. Robert Patterson was Bibb County's chief medical examiner, a meticulous man in his early 60s with decades of experience. When Dr. Chen explained her findings, he became very interested. Ethylene glycol? You're certain? The crystals are unmistakable. And her symptoms, the confusion, the respiratory distress, the rapid deterioration, all consistent with antifreeze poisoning. How much are we talking about? Based on the concentration, I'd say she ingested a significant amount over an extended period. This wasn't a single dose. This was chronic exposure. There was a pause. Then Dr. Patterson said quietly, You understand what you're suggesting? I do. And that's why I'm calling you. This needs a full forensic autopsy, not just a routine one. I'll clear my schedule. When can you send her over? She's already en route to your facility. Dr. Patterson performed the autopsy on Thursday, September 5th, with 2 assistants and a police photographer present. He worked methodically, documenting everything, collecting samples, noting every detail. What he found confirmed Dr. Chen's suspicions and revealed even more disturbing details. Miriam's kidneys showed extensive damage consistent with ethylene glycol toxicity, The calcium oxalate crystals had formed throughout the tissue, destroying function. Her liver was similarly compromised. The concentration of antifreeze in her system suggested she'd been ingesting it regularly for at least 3 to 4 weeks, possibly longer. But there were other findings that troubled Dr. Patterson even more. Miriam's stomach contents showed she'd eaten very little in the hours before her death. Some crackers, tea. Testing of the stomach contents revealed traces of ethylene glycol mixed with what appeared to be herbal tea. There were old bruises on Miriam's upper arms in various stages of healing, suggesting she'd been grabbed or restrained multiple times over the past several weeks. There were defensive wounds on her hands, small cuts and abrasions that looked like she'd braced herself against something. And most disturbing of all, in the deep tissue of her throat, Dr. Patterson found evidence of past trauma consistent with being choked or strangled, though not recently enough to have caused her death. This woman was being abused, Dr. Patterson told Detective Marcus Riley when he called to report his findings. The poisoning was the final act, but she'd been suffering for a while. Detective Riley, a 15-year veteran of the Macon Police Department, had handled his share of suspicious deaths. But a pastor poisoning his wife? That was new. You're certain this was homicide? No question. The concentration of ethylene glycol, the pattern of exposure, the presence of it in her food, this was deliberate and sustained. Someone was feeding her poison, probably in small doses to make it look like illness. Then they gave her a final, fatal dose. Who had access to her food? According to the husband's statement, they lived alone. He'd be the obvious suspect. Pastor Raymond Holt, Riley said, writing the name in his notebook. Respected community leader, been preaching at Grace Covenant for almost 20 years. This is going to cause a hell of a stir. I'm issuing a preliminary finding of homicide. You'll need to investigate. Already on it. Detective Riley's first stop was the Holt residence on Magnolia Lane. He arrived Friday morning with his partner, Detective Sandra Thompson, and a search warrant. Raymond answered the door in casual clothes, khakis and a polo shirt, looking surprised. Detective Riley, Detective Thompson, he said, reading their badges. Can I help you? Mr. Holt, we have a warrant to search your home. The medical examiner has determined that your wife's death is being investigated as a homicide. The color drained from Raymond's face. Homicide? That's impossible. Miriam was sick. You can't think We're not thinking anything yet, sir. But we need to conduct a thorough investigation. Please step aside. Raymond stood in the living room, watching with increasing agitation as police officers methodically went through his home. They photographed everything, collected samples, bagged potential evidence. In the kitchen, they found a ceramic teapot with dried tea residue. In the pantry, they found several boxes of herbal tea, chamomile, peppermint, ginger. In the garage, they found a half-empty jug of antifreeze for Raymond's car. Detective Thompson interviewed Raymond while the search continued. Mr. Holt, can you walk me through the last few weeks? When did your wife start feeling ill? Raymond sat on his couch, his hands clasped tightly. Maybe 3 weeks ago? She started complaining of headaches and stomach pain. I thought it was stress. She'd been working very hard at the church. Did she see a doctor? No. Miriam didn't believe in running to doctors for every little thing. She preferred natural remedies and prayer. What kind of natural remedies? Teas mostly. Herbal teas. She'd drink them several times a day. Did you prepare these teas for her? Raymond hesitated just a fraction too long. Sometimes. If she was feeling too poorly to get up, I'd make her a cup and bring it to her. Where did you keep the antifreeze for your car? The question seemed to catch him off guard. In the garage. Why? How often do you use it? I don't know. Occasionally. When the car needs it. When was the last time you used it? I couldn't say exactly. Maybe a month ago? Detective Thompson made notes. Mr. Holt, were you and your wife having any marital problems? No. We had a strong marriage. Built on faith and mutual respect. No arguments? No disagreements. Of course we had occasional disagreements. All couples do. But nothing serious. Was your wife happy? Raymond's jaw tightened. She was content. She understood her role as a Christian wife. Submission, service, devotion. She fulfilled it well. That's an interesting way to describe a marriage. Did she ever express wanting more? More independence, more voice in decisions. Detective, I'm not sure what you're implying, but my wife was perfectly happy with our arrangement. I provided for her, protected her, guided her spiritually. She wanted for nothing. Except maybe the ability to make her own choices? Raymond stood abruptly. I don't appreciate your tone. I've just lost my wife and you're treating me like a criminal. Unless you're going to arrest me, I'd like you to leave. We'll leave when our search is complete, Mr. Holt. But we'll need to speak with you again. The search of the Holt home yielded several pieces of potential evidence. The teapot with residue, the antifreeze jug, tea bags from the pantry, and, most significantly, a small journal that Detective Riley found tucked between the mattress and box spring in the master bedroom. The journal was Miriam's, filled with her neat handwriting. Riley flipped through it quickly and saw entries dating back several months. He bagged it as evidence without reading it in detail, but what he glimpsed was enough to make him believe they were on the right track. Back at the station, Riley and Thompson read through Miriam's journal carefully. What they found painted a picture of a marriage that was far from the loving partnership Raymond described. The entries began in April 1996, 5 months before Miriam's death. April 12, 1996. I don't know why I'm starting this journal. Maybe I just need somewhere to put my thoughts since I can't speak them aloud. Raymond wouldn't approve. He says introspection is self-indulgent. But I need to process what's happening to me, to us. I feel like I'm disappearing. Like every day I become a little less Miriam and a little more just an extension of Raymond's will. April 20, 1996. Today Raymond gave a sermon on submission. The wives in the congregation nodded and smiled. They think it's beautiful, this idea of surrendering yourself completely to your husband. But they don't live with Raymond. They don't know what real submission looks like in practice. Never disagreeing, never questioning, never expressing a preference that differs from his. They don't know that submission can feel like suffocation. May 3, 1996. I made the mistake of suggesting we visit my sister in Atlanta for her birthday. Raymond said no, we had too many church obligations. When I pressed, gently, so gently, he grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and told me, "Don't forget who made you who you are. You were nothing before me. A shy, awkward girl with no purpose. I gave you purpose. I gave you a role. Don't throw that away by being selfish." May 15, 1996. I'm tired all the time. Raymond says it's because I'm not praying enough, not trusting God enough. But I think it's because I've forgotten how to be a person instead of a performance. The entries continued through May and June, chronicling small moments of control and criticism that together formed a pattern of abuse. Raymond monitoring her phone calls. Raymond questioning her grocery purchases. Raymond telling her what to wear, what to say, how to act. Then, in late June, came an entry that changed everything. June 28, 1996. I know. I finally know, and I wish I didn't. I was at church early this morning to set up for Bible study when I heard voices in Raymond's office. Giggling. A woman's giggling. I stood outside the door, frozen. Then I heard Raymond's voice, low and intimate. "You're beautiful. So beautiful. Not like." He stopped himself, but I knew he was going to say, "Not like her. Not like me." I opened the door without knocking. Raymond was sitting at his desk, and Tessa Groves, the new choir member, she's 26, practically a child, was perched on the edge of his desk, her hand on his shoulder. They jumped apart when they saw me. Raymond immediately stood up, his face going through several emotions: surprise, anger, calculation. "Miriam," he said, "Sister Tessa was just discussing some music selections." But I saw the truth in his eyes. In her eyes, guilty and defiant at once. This has been going on. Maybe for weeks, maybe months. My husband, who preaches about sanctity and fidelity and godly marriage, is having an affair. Detective Riley looked up from the journal. This gives us motive. She discovered his affair, probably threatened to expose him or leave him, and he decided to get rid of her. Thompson nodded. Keep reading. It gets worse. June 29, 1996. I confronted Raymond last night after church. I waited until we were home and then I told him I knew about Tessa. He didn't deny it. He didn't even look ashamed. He looked annoyed, like I was creating an inconvenience. "It doesn't mean anything," he said. "She's young and impressionable. I'm mentoring her." I laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Mentoring? Is that what you call it?" That's when his expression changed. He got very quiet, very still. Then he said, "Miriam, you need to be very careful here. Think about what you're risking. Your home, your position in the church, your entire identity is tied to being Pastor Holt's wife. If you make a scene about this, if you try to embarrass me, you'll lose everything. You'll be nothing again." I asked if he was threatening me. He smiled, actually smiled, and said, "I'm reminding you of reality. You exist because I allow it. Don't forget that." July 3, 1996. I've been thinking about divorce. The word itself feels like blasphemy. 24 years of marriage gone. But how can I stay with a man who treats me like property? Who's sleeping with someone young enough to be his daughter? I called my sister today while Raymond was at a church meeting. I told her everything. She was furious, wanted me to leave immediately. She said I could stay with her in Atlanta, that she'd help me get back on my feet. The idea is terrifying and thrilling at the same time. To be free. To make my own choices. To just be Miriam, whoever that is anymore. July 10, 1996. I told Raymond I want a divorce. I waited until after dinner, chose my moment carefully, tried to be calm and rational. I said our marriage is broken beyond repair, that his affair has made it impossible to continue. I expected anger. Instead, he got very quiet. Then he said, "You won't divorce me. I won't allow it." I said he can't stop me, that I've already contacted a lawyer. That's when he grabbed me. His hands around my throat, squeezing. Not enough to really hurt me, but enough to scare me. Enough to show me he could. "Listen very carefully," he whispered. "You're not leaving me. You're not embarrassing me. You're not destroying what I've built here. If you try, you'll regret it. Do you understand?" I couldn't speak with his hands on my throat, so I just nodded. He let go. I gasped for air. He straightened his shirt and said, "Good. Now make some tea. All this drama has given me a headache." Riley felt his anger rising as he read. This was a clear escalation, from emotional abuse to physical violence, from control to direct threats. The journal entries after July 10th showed a different Miriam, frightened, trapped, but still trying to find a way out. July 15, 1996. I haven't given up on leaving. I've just realized I need to be smarter about it. I'm gathering documents, bank statements, property deeds, anything I might need. I'm putting money aside in small amounts Raymond won't notice. I'm making a plan. July 22, 1996. Raymond has been different lately. Nicer almost. Making me tea in the evenings, asking about my day, being affectionate. It would be touching if I didn't know it was manipulation. He's trying to convince me not to leave. Or maybe he's trying to convince himself he's not a monster. Either way, I'm not fooled. August 1, 1996. I've been feeling strange. Tired, nauseous, dizzy. Raymond says I'm run down, that I need to rest more. He's been very attentive, bringing me tea every evening, insisting I drink it. "It'll help you feel better," he says. I want to believe him. Part of me wants to believe he still cares, that our marriage can be saved. But another part, a growing part, is scared of him. August 10, 1996. The nausea is getting worse. I threw up twice today. Raymond seems concerned, but also, I don't know. There's something in his eyes when he looks at me now. Something I can't quite identify. Yesterday he brought me tea and stood there watching until I drank it all. "Every drop," he said. "It's good for you." The tea tasted sweet, almost syrupy. I didn't want to drink it, but I did because arguing takes energy I don't have. August 20, 1996. I'm getting sicker. My vision is blurry. My hands shake. I have constant headaches. Raymond says it's stress, that I'm worrying myself sick. He might be right. The stress of living with him, of knowing he wants me gone but won't let me leave, of feeling like I'm in a trap with no exit. Maybe it is making me sick. Or maybe, God, I hate even thinking this, maybe he's doing something to me. Making me sick somehow. Is that crazy? Am I paranoid? But why else would he insist I drink that tea? Why else would he watch me so carefully to make sure I finish it all? Detective Thompson pointed to that entry. She knew. On some level, she knew he was poisoning her. But she couldn't prove it, Riley said. And she probably didn't want to believe it. That's a hell of a thing to accept, that your husband of 24 years is trying to kill you. The final entries in the journal were brief, Miriam's handwriting becoming shakier and harder to read. August 28, 1996. Can barely write. So tired. Can't think straight. Need to get help but can't move. Raymond says rest. Says pray. Says trust God. But God, where are you? September 1, 1996. If anything happens to me, please look at Raymond. Please. Check the tea. That was the last entry. 2 days later, Miriam would be dead. Riley closed the journal and looked at Thompson. We have him. Motive, means, opportunity, and her own written testimony that she suspected he was poisoning her. We need to build the case carefully, Thompson said. A pastor with 20 years of community service, no criminal record, well-liked? The prosecutor is going to want this airtight. They worked methodically over the next 2 weeks, gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses. The toxicology report on the tea residue from the teapot came back positive for ethylene glycol, antifreeze mixed with chamomile tea, the sweet taste masking the poison. Forensic analysis of the antifreeze jug in Raymond's garage showed his fingerprints and small amounts of residue that matched what was found in Miriam's system. A check of credit card records showed Raymond had purchased a new jug of antifreeze in late July, even though his car's maintenance records showed it hadn't needed any that month. But perhaps most damning was the testimony from church members who, when interviewed carefully, revealed cracks in the perfect image Raymond had projected. Diane Martinez, who'd known the Holts for 12 years, told detectives, "Miriam was always very quiet, very submissive. Raymond spoke for her most of the time. If you asked Miriam a direct question, she'd look at Raymond first, like she needed his permission to answer. I always thought it was just old-fashioned marriage dynamics, you know? But looking back it seems wrong. Like she was afraid of him." Thomas Chin, a deacon at the church, said, "Raymond was very particular about how things were done. His way was the only way. If anyone questioned him, even gently, even respectfully, he'd shut them down. He preached a lot about submission and obedience, about knowing your place in God's hierarchy." I remember once Miriam suggested changing the schedule for Bible study to accommodate working mothers, and Raymond publicly rebuked her, said she was being rebellious and undermining his authority. And then there was Tessa Groves, the choir member. Detectives tracked her down at her apartment. She was 26, blonde, attractive in a wholesome way. When they told her why they were there, she burst into tears. "I know what you must think of me," she sobbed. "I'm so ashamed. It was wrong. All of it was so wrong." "Tell us about your relationship with Pastor Holt," Riley said gently. Tessa took a shaky breath. "It started about 6 months ago. I just joined the church and Raymond, Pastor Holt, he was so charismatic, so compelling. He took an interest in me, said I had a beautiful voice, that I could really serve God through music. We started having private meetings to discuss my role in the choir. And then one day he told me I was special. That he felt a connection with me he hadn't felt in years. That his marriage was dead, that he and Miriam were only together for appearances. Did you believe him?" "I wanted to. He made me feel seen, valued. And he was so confident, so certain. When he kissed me the first time, I told myself it was okay because his marriage was essentially over anyway. We started meeting regularly, always in secret, always carefully. He said we had to be discreet to protect the church, but really, it was to protect himself." "When did Miriam find out?" "Late June. She walked in on us. We weren't doing anything explicit. I was just sitting on his desk, we were talking, but it was obvious. The way we jumped apart, the guilt on our faces. She knew." "How did Raymond react?" "At first he was smooth. Tried to play it off like I was just a parishioner. But I could tell he was furious. After Miriam left, he told me we needed to be more careful, that if word got out, it could destroy everything." "Did he say anything about Miriam? About what she might do?" Tessa was quiet for a long moment. "He said she was becoming a problem. That she was threatening to leave him, to expose the affair. He said he couldn't let that happen, that too much was at stake." "Did he say what he planned to do about it?" "Not specifically. But there was something in his tone that scared me. A coldness. Like Miriam was an obstacle to be removed rather than a person. I told myself I was reading too much into it." "When did you last see Raymond?" "About 3 weeks ago. I ended things. Told him I couldn't keep living a lie, that what we were doing was sinful. He was angry, but he didn't fight it. Looking back, I wonder if he didn't care because he was already planning." She couldn't finish. "Did you know Miriam was sick?" "I heard she wasn't feeling well. But I didn't know how serious it was." "I certainly didn't know. God, did he really kill her?" "That's what we're trying to determine." After Tessa left, Riley and Thompson compared notes. "So we have an affair, we have Miriam threatening to expose him and file for divorce, we have Raymond making statements about her being a problem, and we have physical evidence of poisoning," Riley summarized. "I think we have enough." On September 20, 1996, Detective Riley and Detective Thompson arrived at Grace Covenant Church during Thursday evening Bible study. Raymond was teaching, standing at the front of a room filled with about 50 people, Bible open, speaking about forgiveness and redemption. "The world tells us to hold grudges, to seek revenge when we're wronged," Raymond was saying. "But God calls us to a higher standard. To forgive as we've been forgiven. To show grace even when." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw the detectives enter. His expression flickered. Surprise, then concern, then careful neutrality. "Excuse me," he said to the congregation. "It seems I have visitors. Let's take a brief break." He walked toward the detectives, his smile practiced. "Detectives, I wasn't expecting you. Is there news about Miriam's case? Pastor Holt, Riley said formally, we need you to come with us to the station. Now. I'm in the middle of teaching. Now. Something in Riley's tone made Raymond's smile falter. Am I being arrested? Not at this moment. But we have questions that need to be answered, and we'd prefer to do this downtown. The congregation was watching, whispering. Raymond maintained his composure, but his hands clenched at his sides. Very well. Let me just dismiss class. We'll wait. Raymond returned to the front of the room. Brothers and sisters, I apologize, but I need to cut our study short this evening. The police have questions about Miriam's death. I'm sure it's just procedural, but I want to cooperate fully. Please keep me in your prayers. Murmurs of support. We're with you, Pastor. God is with you. At the police station, Raymond was placed in an interview room. Riley and Thompson let him sit there for 30 minutes before entering, a deliberate tactic to increase his anxiety. When they finally sat down across from him, Raymond looked composed but wary. Am I under arrest? He asked again. Not yet, Riley said. But we have some serious questions. You have the right to an attorney. I don't need an attorney. I have nothing to hide. Then you won't mind answering some questions about your wife's death? Of course not. I want to help in any way I can. Riley pulled out a folder and opened it. Pastor Holt, the medical examiner has determined that your wife died from ethylene glycol poisoning. Antifreeze. Someone was feeding her poison over a period of several weeks. Raymond's face went pale. That's impossible. It's not only possible, it's proven. The question is who did it? Who had access to Miriam's food and drink? I mean we lived alone, but surely someone could have. He stopped, seeming to realize how weak that sounded. We found antifreeze in the teapot you used to make Miriam's evening tea. We found your fingerprints on the antifreeze jug in your garage. We have credit card receipts showing you purchased antifreeze in July even though your car didn't need any. This is insane. Why would I poison my own wife? Thompson leaned forward. We think we know why. Let me read you something. She pulled out a copy of Miriam's journal. This is from your wife's journal, dated June 28th. I know about Raymond and Tessa. My husband is having an affair. Raymond's jaw tightened. And this one from July 10th. I told Raymond I want a divorce. He grabbed me by the throat and told me I'd regret it if I tried to leave. That journal is a fabrication. It's in Miriam's handwriting. We've had it verified. Then she was delusional, imagining things. We've spoken to Tessa Groves, Riley interrupted. She confirmed the affair. She said you told her Miriam was becoming a problem. Raymond stood abruptly. I'm not saying another word without a lawyer. That's your right. But understand this, we know what you did. We have the evidence. It's just a matter of time now. Raymond was arrested the next day and charged with first-degree murder. The arrest of Pastor Raymond Holt sent shockwaves through Macon's religious community. Some members of Grace Covenant refused to believe it, insisting there must be some mistake, that the police were persecuting a man of God. Others, particularly women who'd always sensed something wrong in the Holt marriage, felt vindicated and horrified. The trial was set for March 1997. Raymond hired one of Georgia's best criminal defense attorneys, Martin Blackwell, a silver-haired man in his 60s known for getting acquittals in seemingly hopeless cases. Blackwell's strategy was clear from the beginning: admit the affair but deny the murder, paint Miriam as mentally unstable, and create reasonable doubt about Raymond's involvement in her death. The trial began on March 10, 1997 at the Bibb County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed every single day: church members, journalists, curious citizens. The case had everything: religion, sex, poison, betrayal. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Catherine Morrison, a sharp woman in her 40s who'd built a reputation on meticulous preparation and devastating cross-examinations. In her opening statement, Morrison laid out the case with clinical precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about control. For 24 years, Raymond Holt controlled his wife Miriam. He controlled what she did, what she said, how she thought. He presented them to the world as the perfect Christian couple, but behind closed doors he was a tyrant. He emotionally abused her, isolated her, made her believe she was nothing without him. And when she finally found the courage to leave him, when she discovered his affair and demanded a divorce, he decided that if he couldn't control her, he'd eliminate her. Over the course of several weeks, Raymond Holt fed his wife antifreeze mixed in her nightly tea. He watched her get sicker and sicker. He told her it was the flu, told her to pray harder. And when she finally collapsed on their kitchen floor, Dying in agony, he waited. He didn't call 911 immediately. He waited until she was beyond saving. Because that's what abusers do. They take everything, even life itself, rather than lose control. The defense's opening statement painted a very different picture. "My client is not on trial for being a bad husband," Blackwell began. "He's on trial for murder. And the prosecution wants you to believe he's guilty because he made mistakes in his marriage. Yes, Raymond Holt had an affair. He's admitted that. It was wrong, it was sinful, and he's deeply ashamed. But having an affair doesn't make you a murderer. The prosecution's case is built on circumstantial evidence and the ramblings of a disturbed woman. Miriam Holt was mentally ill. Her journal shows paranoia, delusion, irrational fears. Yes, she died of antifreeze poisoning. But there's no concrete evidence that Raymond administered it. Miriam had access to the garage, to the antifreeze, just as much as Raymond did. In her disturbed state, she could have ingested it herself, either accidentally or deliberately. This is a tragedy, but it's not a murder. The prosecution's case took 2 weeks to present. Dr. Robert Patterson testified about the autopsy findings, explaining in detail how antifreeze poisoning kills slowly and painfully. The victim would have experienced nausea, confusion, extreme pain, organ failure, Dr. Patterson explained. This wasn't quick. This was torture. Dr. Chin testified about Miriam's condition when she arrived at the hospital. She was in multisystem organ failure. Her body was shutting down. The level of toxicity suggested chronic exposure over weeks. Forensic toxicologist Dr. James Wu testified about the antifreeze found in the teapot. The concentration was significant. Someone mixed approximately 2 ounces of ethylene glycol into the tea. Over time, regular consumption of tea prepared this way would be fatal. Detectives Riley and Thompson testified about the investigation, the evidence collected, Raymond's statements. But the most powerful testimony came from people who knew Miriam. Her sister, Claire Davidson, took the stand in tears. "Miriam called me in July," Claire testified. "She told me Raymond was having an affair. She said she wanted to leave him, but she was scared. I told her to come stay with me in Atlanta, that I'd help her. But she said Raymond wouldn't let her go. She said," Claire's voice broke. "She said if anything happened to her, to make sure the police looked at Raymond." Objection. Blackwell was on his feet. "Hearsay. It's a statement against interest, Your Honor," Morrison countered. "It goes to the victim's state of mind." "I'll allow it," Judge Howard Preston ruled. Claire continued. "The last time I spoke to Miriam was August 30th. She sounded terrible, weak, confused. She kept saying she didn't feel well. I begged her to go to the hospital. She said Raymond told her it was just the flu. I should have insisted. I should have driven there and taken her myself." Marcus Williams, who'd known the Holts through church, testified, "Raymond was very controlling. Everything had to be his way. I remember once we were planning a church picnic, and Miriam suggested hot dogs as well as hamburgers. Raymond shut her down immediately, said hamburgers were sufficient and she was overcomplicating things. It seemed harsh to me, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Looking back, I see how he diminished her constantly." Diane Martinez testified, "I loved Miriam. She was kind and generous. But she always seemed sad, like she was carrying a heavy weight. Once I asked if everything was okay and she started to say something, then stopped and said, 'Raymond says I shouldn't burden others with complaints.' That struck me as odd, calling concerns about your well-being complaints." And then there was Tessa Grove's testimony, which captivated the courtroom. Tessa wore a conservative dress, her hair pulled back, no makeup. She looked young and scared. "Ms. Groves," Morrison began gently, "how did you meet the defendant?" "I joined Grace Covenant Church in January 1996. Pastor Holt, Raymond, welcomed me personally, said he'd like to learn more about me." "When did your relationship become inappropriate?" "March maybe. He started asking me to stay after choir practice to discuss my spiritual growth. Then he started telling me I was special, that he felt a connection with me." "Did he tell you about his marriage?" "He said it was empty. That Miriam was cold and unresponsive. That they'd grown apart years ago and only stayed together for appearances." "Did you believe him?" "I wanted to. He was charming, authoritative. And I was flattered that someone like him would notice me." "When did the relationship become physical?" Tessa's face flushed. "April. He kissed me after a church meeting. From then on, we'd meet secretly, at his office, sometimes at my apartment when he could get away." "Did you feel guilty?" "Yes. But he always reassured me that his marriage was essentially over, that Miriam knew it too, that we weren't really hurting anyone." What happened when Miriam discovered the affair? She walked in on us. Raymond immediately became defensive, angry. After she left, he told me this was a disaster, that Miriam could ruin everything. Did he explain what he meant by ruin everything? His reputation, his position, his career. He'd built this image as a godly pastor, and an affair and divorce would destroy that. Did he say what he planned to do? He said he'd handle it. That Miriam wouldn't be a problem much longer. Wouldn't be a problem much longer. Those were his exact words. Yes. On cross-examination, Blackwell tried to discredit Tessa. Ms. Groves, isn't it true that you pursued Pastor Holt? No, that's not. You joined the church specifically because you'd heard he was an attractive, charismatic leader? I joined because I was looking for a church home. But you admit you found him attractive? I suppose, but... And when the affair ended, you were angry, weren't you? Hurt that he'd chosen to try to work on his marriage rather than be with you? I ended the relationship because it was wrong. Or you ended it because you realized he'd never leave his wife for you, and now you're seeking revenge by trying to frame him for murder? That's not true. I'm telling the truth about what happened. But Blackwell had planted the seed of doubt. The most damning evidence was Miriam's journal. Morrison read selected entries aloud to the jury, her voice steady as she recounted Miriam's growing fear and suspicion. When she read the entry about Raymond choking Miriam, several jurors visibly reacted. When she read the final entry, "If anything happens to me, please look at Raymond," the courtroom was silent. Blackwell objected strenuously to the journal's admission, arguing it was hearsay and couldn't be cross-examined. But Judge Preston ruled that as a contemporaneous record of the victim's state of mind and experiences, it was admissible. The prosecution rested after 2.5 weeks. The defense case was shorter, focused on creating reasonable doubt. Blackwell called a toxicology expert who testified that yes, antifreeze poisoning was proven, but no, there was no definitive evidence about who administered it. He called a forensic psychiatrist who'd reviewed Miriam's journal and concluded she showed signs of paranoid delusions and possible personality disorders. She was clearly unstable, Dr. Gerald Foster testified. Her writings show irrational fears, persecution complexes. It's entirely possible she ingested the antifreeze herself, either accidentally or as a cry for help. On cross-examination, Morrison destroyed this theory. Dr. Foster, you testified that Miriam might have ingested antifreeze accidentally. How exactly would one accidentally ingest antifreeze repeatedly over several weeks? Well, if she was using it for some purpose. What purpose? It was in the garage for the car. Why would she be drinking from that jug? I don't know, but... And you suggest she might have done it as a cry for help. But antifreeze poisoning mimics flu symptoms. If she were trying to get attention, wouldn't she choose something more obviously dangerous? Not necessarily. Dr. Foster, have you ever personally encountered a case where someone poisoned themselves with antifreeze over several weeks? Not personally, but... Because it doesn't happen, does it? Antifreeze poisoning is almost always either accidental single exposure or deliberate homicide. There are always exceptions. But you have no evidence that Miriam Holt was one of those exceptions, do you? You're just speculating to help the defense. I'm offering a possible explanation. A possible explanation with no basis in evidence or medical literature. Raymond did not testify. Blackwell advised against it, knowing Morrison would eviscerate him on cross-examination. Closing arguments began on March 31st. Morrison spoke for 2 hours, methodically reviewing every piece of evidence. Raymond Holt wants you to believe this is all a tragic misunderstanding. That his mentally ill wife either accidentally or deliberately poisoned herself, and he's just an innocent bystander. But the evidence tells a different story. It tells the story of a man who controlled his wife for 24 years, who had an affair when he got bored, who threatened violence when she tried to leave, and who ultimately chose murder rather than face the consequences of his actions. He mixed antifreeze into her tea. He watched her drink it night after night. He watched her get sicker. He told her it was the flu, told her to pray more. And when she finally collapsed, he waited. He waited until she was dying before calling for help. Because that's what he wanted. He wanted her dead. The journal entries show Miriam's growing fear. The forensic evidence shows the method. The witness testimony shows the motive. And Raymond's own words, "She won't be a problem much longer," show his intent. This was not an accident. This was not suicide. This was murder, calculated and cruel. And Raymond Holt must be held accountable. Blackwell's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt. The prosecution wants you to be angry. They want you to see a bad husband and assume he's a murderer. But that's not how justice works. Yes, Raymond Holt had an affair. Yes, he was controlling. Yes, he made mistakes. But mistakes don't equal murder. Where's the concrete evidence? Where's the witness who saw him put antifreeze in the tea? Where's the confession? There isn't any. What you have is circumstantial evidence that could be interpreted multiple ways. You have a disturbed woman's journal full of paranoid accusations. You have a mistress who might have an axe to grind. But you don't have proof beyond reasonable doubt. And in America, we don't convict people on suspicion and circumstantial evidence. We convict them on proof. The prosecution hasn't met that burden. You must find Raymond Holt not guilty. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On April 3, 1997, they returned with their verdict. The courtroom was packed, standing room only. Raymond sat at the defense table, his face carefully neutral. Across the aisle, Claire Davidson and other members of Miriam's family waited with clenched hands. Judge Preston addressed the jury foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. How do you find? In the case of State of Georgia versus Raymond Holt, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Shouts of relief from Miriam's family. Gasps from Raymond's supporters. Raymond himself sat frozen, his face draining of color. Order. Judge Preston banged his gavel. I will have order in this courtroom. The bailiff moved to stand beside Raymond, who seemed to come back to himself. He looked at his attorney, his expression bewildered. This isn't right, he said loud enough for nearby reporters to hear. I'm innocent. They're wrong. But the jury had spoken. Sentencing was scheduled for April 25. During the 3 weeks between conviction and sentencing, both sides prepared their arguments. The prosecution would push for life without parole. The defense would argue for leniency based on Raymond's age, his lack of criminal history, and his service to the community. Victim impact statements poured in. Claire Davidson wrote a 15-page letter detailing Miriam's life, her kindness, her fear, and the justice she deserved. My sister spent 24 years married to a man who saw her as property, Claire wrote. She endured emotional abuse, control, and ultimately murder. Raymond Holt deserves the maximum punishment allowed by law. Nothing less will honor Miriam's memory. Church members were divided. Some wrote letters supporting Raymond, describing his years of spiritual leadership and community service. Others wrote condemning him, expressing horror at his crimes and relief that the truth had emerged. One letter, from a woman named Susan Porter who'd been a member of Grace Covenant for 10 years, was particularly pointed. I always sensed something wrong in Raymond's teachings. He preached submission for women in a way that felt oppressive, controlling. He'd use scripture to justify his authority but ignore passages about love, gentleness, mutual respect. Now I understand he was preaching what he practiced at home. He was justifying his abuse with religion. That makes his crimes even worse. He didn't just kill Miriam's body. He spent years killing her spirit, using God's word as a weapon. On April 25, 1997, the courtroom was once again packed for sentencing. Raymond stood before Judge Preston, flanked by his attorneys. He'd aged noticeably in the weeks since the verdict. His hair grayer, his face more lined, his shoulders slumped. Judge Preston reviewed the case file, the letters, the evidence. Then he looked at Raymond. Mr. Holt, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of murdering your wife through a slow, torturous poisoning. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything to say? Raymond nodded. His attorney had advised him to express remorse, to ask for mercy. But when Raymond spoke, what came out was something else entirely. Your Honor, I've spent the past weeks reflecting on my marriage, on what happened. And I want to say, he paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Miriam was weak. She always was. I spent 24 years trying to guide her, to shape her into something better. I gave her purpose. I gave her a role. Before me she was nothing, a shy, awkward girl with no direction. I made her who she was. I made her Pastor Holt's wife, gave her standing in the community, gave her meaning. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. His attorney put a hand on his arm, trying to stop him, but Raymond shook him off. Everything she had came from me. And how did she repay me? By threatening to leave, to embarrass me, to destroy what I'd built. She became rebellious, disobedient. She forgot her place. I tried to remind her. I tried to correct her. But she wouldn't listen. Mr. Holt, Judge Preston tried to interrupt, but Raymond kept talking. So yes, I made decisions. Difficult decisions. To protect my ministry, my reputation, everything I'd worked for. Miriam was going to ruin it all out of selfishness and spite. I couldn't allow that. I had to. He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize what he was saying. His attorney's face was buried in his hands. The courtroom was silent, everyone staring at Raymond in horror and disbelief. He'd essentially just confessed on the record in open court. Judge Preston's expression was one of controlled fury. Mr. Holt, I've been a judge for 23 years. I've sentenced murderers, rapists, child abusers. But I've never heard anything quite like what you just said. You stood before this court and justified the murder of your wife by claiming you made her who she was, that she was rebellious for wanting to leave an abusive marriage. You showed not 1 ounce of remorse. Not one moment of recognition that Miriam was a human being with rights and dignity. Raymond started to speak, but Preston raised his hand. I'm not finished. The prosecution has asked for life without parole. They argue that your crime was calculated, cruel, and showed a complete lack of empathy. Your defense has asked for leniency based on your age, your service to the community, and your lack of prior record. I've considered both arguments carefully. He paused, looking at the papers before him. Raymond Holt, for the murder of Miriam Holt, I sentence you to 28 years in the Georgia State Prison System. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then chaos. 28 years? Claire Davidson was on her feet, screaming. He tortured my sister for weeks and you give him 28 years? Other members of Miriam's family were shouting. Raymond's supporters looked relieved, vindicated. Order. Preston banged his gavel repeatedly. Order in this court. When the room finally quieted, Preston continued. Mr. Holt will be eligible for parole consideration after serving 18 years. In determining this sentence, I've considered several factors. The defendant's age, he's 63, meaning he'll be well into his 80s before potential release. His long service to the community, which, while not excusing his crime, does reflect a lifetime that included positive contributions. His lack of prior criminal history. And yes, the fact that this was his first offense. First offense. Someone in the gallery shouted. He murdered someone. Preston ignored the interruption. However, I want to be clear. This sentence should not be interpreted as lenient. Mr. Holt will spend the prime of what remains of his life in prison. He will lose his freedom, his reputation, his position in the community. Everything he valued, everything he killed to protect is gone. That is his punishment. Claire Davidson collapsed into her seat, sobbing. It's not enough. It's not justice. Preston's expression softened slightly as he looked at Miriam's family. I understand your pain and your anger. No sentence will bring Miriam back or undo what she suffered. But this is the sentence I believe is appropriate under Georgia law. Raymond was handcuffed and led away. As he passed the gallery, he looked at his former congregation members who'd come to support him. He smiled, just slightly, a small smirk that suggested he'd won something even in defeat. Several people in the courtroom noticed. That smile would be reported in newspapers, discussed on talk radio, remembered as evidence of Raymond Holt's complete lack of remorse. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed both sides. Claire Davidson, her face streaked with tears, spoke into a cluster of microphones. This is not justice. My sister was tortured and murdered by a man who saw her as property. And he gets 28 years? He'll probably be paroled in less than 20. He could be walking free in his 80s, living out his final years comfortable and free, while Miriam never got to live past 51. This is wrong. This is a failure of our justice system. ADA Catherine Morrison tried to provide context. While we're disappointed the sentence wasn't life without parole, we respect the judge's decision. Raymond Holt will spend significant time in prison. He's been held accountable for his crime. That's important. Martin Blackwell, Raymond's attorney, was more triumphant. Justice was served today. The prosecution wanted to destroy Raymond Holt's entire life over a tragic situation. The judge recognized that there were mitigating factors. Raymond's age, his contributions to society, the fact that he made one terrible mistake in an otherwise exemplary life. 28 years is a substantial sentence. We're grateful the court showed some measure of mercy. That word, mercy, became a flashpoint. Talk radio shows exploded with debate. Should mercy be extended to someone who showed none to their victim? Should a person's past good deeds mitigate the horror of murder? The case sparked a broader conversation about domestic violence, about how abusers often present a charming public face while terrorizing their victims in private, about how churches and religious communities sometimes enable abuse by preaching submission and discouraging women from leaving dangerous marriages. Women's advocacy groups held rallies outside the courthouse, demanding reforms to how domestic violence cases were handled, how sentences were determined. Raymond Holt got 28 years because he was a respected pastor, one advocate said at a rally. If he'd been a poor black man with no community standing, he'd have gotten life without parole. This sentence reflects our society's continued devaluation of women's lives and our willingness to excuse men in positions of power. The case also prompted many women to come forward with their own stories of abuse within religious communities, stories of being told to submit, to pray more, to stay with violent husbands because divorce was sinful. Miriam Holt's story is not unique, wrote columnist Sandra Mills in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. What's unique is that her murder was exposed and prosecuted. How many other women are suffering in silence, trapped in marriages where they're controlled, belittled, and abused, all in the name of biblical submission? How many more Miriams will die before we acknowledge that twisted interpretations of Scripture can be deadly? Grace Covenant Church struggled in the aftermath of the trial. Attendance dropped by more than half. Many members left, unable to reconcile the Raymond they'd known with the murderer he'd been revealed to be. A small group of loyalists remained, insisting Raymond had been framed or that the trial had been unfair. They continued to visit him in prison, to write him letters of support, to pray for his release. But the majority of the congregation recognized the truth. They'd been deceived for years by a man who preached one thing and practiced another. The church brought in new leadership, a husband and wife co-pastor team who immediately began addressing the toxic theology that had enabled Raymond's abuse. "We're starting over," Pastor Linda Chin told the remaining congregation. "We're going to build a church based on mutual respect, equality, and genuine love, not control, not hierarchy, not twisted interpretations of submission that turn women into property." Miriam's family established a foundation in her name, the Miriam Holt Foundation for Domestic Violence Awareness. The foundation provided resources for women in abusive marriages, offered counseling, helped with legal fees for those seeking divorce from violent partners. "Miriam didn't get to escape," Claire Davidson said at the foundation's launch. "But we're going to help other women escape. We're going to make sure her death means something." The foundation partnered with churches to develop training programs for clergy on recognizing and responding to domestic violence. They created educational materials about the warning signs of abuse. They also advocated for legal reforms, stricter sentencing guidelines for domestic violence homicides, better protections for victims trying to leave abusive relationships, mandatory training for judges on the dynamics of domestic abuse. Raymond Holt was sent to Georgia State Prison to begin serving his sentence. He was classified as a medium security inmate and assigned to general population. Prison was a brutal adjustment for a man accustomed to respect and authority. Other inmates didn't care that he'd been a pastor. In fact, it made him a target. Prisoners have their own moral code, and men who kill their wives rank low. Raymond had several altercations in his first year, mostly verbal but occasionally physical. He kept to himself, reading his Bible, maintaining his innocence to anyone who would listen. He wrote letters to former church members, to religious organizations, claiming he'd been wrongly convicted, that he was a victim of an overzealous prosecutor and a biased media. Most recipients threw the letters away. In 1999, Raymond's first appeal was denied. The Georgia Supreme Court ruled that the evidence had been properly admitted, the trial fairly conducted, and the verdict supported by overwhelming evidence. In 2001 he tried again, this time arguing ineffective assistance of counsel. He claimed Blackwell had failed to properly defend him, had allowed damaging testimony that should have been excluded. The appeal was denied again. As years passed, Raymond aged rapidly in prison. His hair went completely white. His health declined, high blood pressure, diabetes, arthritis. He spent more time in the prison infirmary than in general population. By 2010, he was 77 years old, frail, a shadow of the commanding figure who'd once held a congregation spellbound. That year he became eligible for parole for the first time. Under his sentence terms, he'd served 18 years and could now petition for early release. The parole hearing was held on June 15, 2010. Raymond appeared via video link from the prison infirmary, where he'd been recovering from a minor stroke. The parole board asked him the standard questions. "Mr. Holt, do you take responsibility for the crime you were convicted of?" Raymond, his speech slightly slurred from the stroke, said carefully, "I was convicted of murder. I've served my time as required by law. That's not what I asked. Do you take responsibility? Do you admit you murdered your wife?" A long pause. Then, "I made mistakes in my marriage. I wasn't the husband I should have been." "That's not an answer. Did you poison your wife with antifreeze?" I was convicted of that crime, yes. Do you believe you did it? I believe I've paid my debt to society. Mr. Holt, have you participated in any rehabilitation programs? I've attended Bible study, anger management classes, and counseling as required. And have those programs helped you understand what you did wrong? They've helped me reflect on my past actions. The board members exchanged glances. Raymond was giving them nothing. No admission of guilt, no remorse, no real acknowledgement of his crime beyond the legal fact of his conviction. Claire Davidson addressed the board, her voice shaking with emotion. Please don't release this man. He's shown no remorse. He's never admitted what he did. In his own words at sentencing, he said my sister was weak and rebellious, that he made her who she was. Those words haunt me. They show how he really saw her, as property, as something he created and therefore had the right to destroy. If you release him, you're telling the world that a man can torture and murder his wife and serve less than 20 years. That's not justice. That's not accountability. Please keep him in prison where he belongs. The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned with their decision, Claire held her breath. Mr. Holt, your petition for parole is denied. You will be eligible to petition again in 3 years. Claire sobbed with relief. Raymond showed no emotion, just nodded slightly and was escorted back to the infirmary. He petitioned for parole again in 2013 at age 80. Again he refused to fully admit his guilt or show genuine remorse. Again he was denied. Mr. Holt continues to minimize his actions and blame his victim, the board wrote in their decision. He has not demonstrated the rehabilitation necessary for release. In 2016, at age 83, Raymond's health had deteriorated significantly. He'd had 2 more strokes, was partially paralyzed on his left side, and was confined to a wheelchair. He required constant medical care. His attorney petitioned for compassionate release, arguing that Raymond posed no danger to society and that keeping an elderly, infirm man in prison served no purpose. The petition included medical records showing Raymond's multiple health conditions, his need for around-the-clock nursing care, his diminished cognitive function. Victims' advocates fought against the release. Miriam never got compassion, one advocate wrote in an op-ed. She never got the chance to grow old, to become frail, to need care. She died at 51, poisoned slowly over weeks in agony. Raymond Holt chose that for her. He doesn't deserve compassion now just because he's old and sick. The petition for compassionate release was denied. The severity of the crime and the defendant's continued lack of remorse outweigh concerns about his age and health, the judge wrote. He will serve the remainder of his sentence. The church brought in new leadership, a husband and wife co-pastor team who immediately began addressing the toxic theology that had enabled Raymond's abuse. We're starting over, Pastor Linda Chin told the remaining congregation. We're going to build a church based on mutual respect, equality, and genuine love, not control, not hierarchy, not twisted interpretations of submission that turn women into property. Miriam's family established a foundation in her name, the Miriam Holt Foundation for Domestic Violence Awareness. The foundation provided resources for women in abusive marriages, offered counseling, helped with legal fees for those seeking divorce from violent partners. Miriam didn't get to escape, Claire Davidson said at the foundation's launch. But we're going to help other women escape. We're going to make sure her death means something. The foundation partnered with churches to develop training programs for clergy on recognizing and responding to domestic violence. They created educational materials about the warning signs of abuse. They also advocated for legal reforms, stricter sentencing guidelines for domestic violence homicides, better protections for victims trying to leave abusive relationships, mandatory training for judges on the dynamics of domestic abuse. Raymond Holt was sent to Georgia State Prison to begin serving his sentence. He was classified as a medium security inmate and assigned to general population. Prison was a brutal adjustment for a man accustomed to respect and authority. Other inmates didn't care that he'd been a pastor. In fact, it made him a target. Prisoners have their own moral code and men who kill their wives rank low. Raymond had several altercations in his first year, mostly verbal but occasionally physical. He kept to himself, reading his Bible, maintaining his innocence to anyone who would listen. He wrote letters to former church members, to religious organizations, claiming he'd been wrongly convicted, that he was a victim of an overzealous prosecutor and a biased media. Most recipients threw the letters away. In 1999, Raymond's first appeal was denied. The Georgia Supreme Court ruled that the evidence had been properly admitted, the trial fairly conducted, and the verdict supported by overwhelming evidence. In 2001 he tried again, this time arguing ineffective assistance of counsel. He claimed Blackwell had failed to properly defend him, had allowed damaging testimony that should have been excluded. The appeal was denied again. As years passed, Raymond aged rapidly in prison. His hair went completely white. His health declined, high blood pressure, diabetes, arthritis. He spent more time in the prison infirmary than in general population. By 2010, he was 77 years old, frail, a shadow of the commanding figure who'd once held a congregation spellbound. That year he became eligible for parole for the first time. Under his sentence terms, he'd served 18 years and could now petition for early release. The parole hearing was held on June 15, 2010. Raymond appeared via video link from the prison infirmary, where he'd been recovering from a minor stroke. The parole board asked him the standard questions. Mr. Holt, do you take responsibility for the crime you were convicted of? Raymond, his speech slightly slurred from the stroke, said carefully, I was convicted of murder. I've served my time as required by law. That's not what I asked. Do you take responsibility? Do you admit you murdered your wife? A long pause. Then, I made mistakes in my marriage. I wasn't the husband I should have been. That's not an answer. Did you poison your wife with antifreeze? I was convicted of that crime, yes. Do you believe you did it? I believe I've paid my debt to society. Mr. Holt, have you participated in any rehabilitation programs? I've attended Bible study, anger management classes, and counseling as required. And have those programs helped you understand what you did wrong? They've helped me reflect on my past actions. The board members exchanged glances. Raymond was giving them nothing. No admission of guilt, no remorse, no real acknowledgement of his crime beyond the legal fact of his conviction. Claire Davidson addressed the board, her voice shaking with emotion. Please don't release this man. He's shown no remorse. He's never admitted what he did. In his own words at sentencing, he said my sister was weak and rebellious, that he made her who she was. Those words haunt me. They show how he really saw her, as property, as something he created and therefore had the right to destroy. If you release him, you're telling the world that a man can torture and murder his wife and serve less than 20 years. That's not justice. That's not accountability. Please keep him in prison where he belongs. The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned with their decision, Claire held her breath. Mr. Holt, your petition for parole is denied. You will be eligible to petition again in 3 years. Claire sobbed with relief. Raymond showed no emotion, just nodded slightly and was escorted back to the infirmary. He petitioned for parole again in 2013 at age 80. Again he refused to fully admit his guilt or show genuine remorse. Again he was denied. Mr. Holt continues to minimize his actions and blame his victim, the board wrote in their decision. He has not demonstrated the rehabilitation necessary for release. In 2016, at age 83, Raymond's health had deteriorated significantly. He'd had 2 more strokes, was partially paralyzed on his left side, and was confined to a wheelchair. He required constant medical care. His attorney petitioned for compassionate release, arguing that Raymond posed no danger to society and that keeping an elderly, infirm man in prison served no purpose. The petition included medical records showing Raymond's multiple health conditions, his need for around-the-clock nursing care, his diminished cognitive function. Victims' advocates fought against the release. Miriam never got compassion, one advocate wrote in an op-ed. She never got the chance to grow old, to become frail, to need care. She died at 51, poisoned slowly over weeks in agony. Raymond Holt chose that for her. He doesn't deserve compassion now just because he's old and sick. The petition for compassionate release was denied. The severity of the crime and the defendant's continued lack of remorse outweigh concerns about his age and health, the judge wrote. He will serve the remainder of his sentence. As of today, Raymond Holt remains incarcerated. He is 91 years old, one of the oldest prisoners in the Georgia system. He spends his days in the prison's medical unit, his mind often confused, his body failing. He still maintains he was wrongly convicted. Staff report that in his more lucid moments he talks about his time as a pastor, about his sermons, about the respect he once commanded. He never mentions Miriam except to say she was difficult and didn't understand her role. Miriam's family visits her grave regularly. She's buried in a quiet cemetery outside Macon, her headstone simple. Miriam Holt, 1945 to 1996. Beloved sister, faithful soul, forever free. Claire Davidson, now in her 70s, continues to run the Miriam Holt Foundation. Over the past 2 decades, The foundation has helped thousands of women escape abusive relationships. Miriam's death broke my heart, Claire said in a recent interview. But if her story has helped even one woman recognize the signs of abuse and get out before it's too late, then maybe something good came from this horror. Maybe Miriam's suffering wasn't entirely in vain. The case of Raymond and Miriam Holt remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power in religious settings, about how abuse can hide behind respectability, about how godly language can mask ungodly cruelty. It's a reminder that domestic violence crosses all social, economic, and religious boundaries. That abusers can be charismatic, respected, seemingly upstanding members of the community. That victims are often trapped not just by physical control but by emotional manipulation, by systematic destruction of their self-worth. And it's a reminder that justice, when it comes, is sometimes imperfect, incomplete, inadequate to the harm done. What do you think about Raymond Holt's sentence? Was 28 years enough for a man who slowly poisoned his wife to death? Should his age and community service have been considered, or should the horror of his crime have resulted in life without parole? This case continues to spark debate about how we sentence domestic violence homicides and whether our justice system adequately values women's lives. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The broader impact of the Holt case extended far beyond one courtroom in Macon, Georgia. It became a catalyst for change in how domestic violence is understood, particularly within religious communities. Seminaries began offering courses on recognizing and responding to domestic abuse. Denominations developed protocols for handling allegations of abuse against clergy. Churches started training volunteers to spot warning signs and provide resources to victims. The Holt case was a wake-up call, said Dr. Patricia Morrison, a professor of pastoral theology. It forced the church to confront uncomfortable truths about how Scripture can be weaponized to control and harm, about how we've often prioritized marriage preservation over individual safety. We realized we needed to do better. Many churches revised their premarital counseling programs to include education about healthy relationships, warning signs of abuse, and resources for getting help. They also developed policies for responding when members disclosed abuse, protocols that prioritized victim safety over keeping families together at all costs. We used to counsel women to stay and pray harder, admitted Pastor David Chin, who'd been a young minister during the Holt trial. We'd tell them that submission meant accepting their husband's authority even when he was wrong, that their suffering could redeem him. Looking back, I'm horrified. We were enabling abuse, trapping women in dangerous situations. The Holt case made us realize that was wrong, not just ineffective but morally wrong. In the legal realm, the case prompted discussions about sentencing disparities. Analysis showed that domestic violence homicides often resulted in lighter sentences than stranger homicides, particularly when the perpetrator was a first-time offender with community standing. We tend to see domestic violence killings as crimes of passion, as tragic but somehow more understandable than real murder, explained criminal justice professor Dr. Amanda Lewis. But the Holt case showed that domestic homicide can be coldly calculated, executed over weeks with careful planning. Miriam's death was torture. Yet Raymond received a sentence that suggests his crime was somehow less serious because it happened within a marriage. Several states, prompted in part by the Holt case and others like it, passed laws mandating harsher sentences for domestic violence homicides, particularly those involving prolonged abuse or particularly cruel methods. Georgia itself passed the Miriam Holt Act in 2002, which enhanced penalties for murders committed by intimate partners when the killing was preceded by a documented pattern of abuse. The law recognizes that domestic violence murder is often the culmination of years of escalating abuse, explained the bill's sponsor, State Senator Maria Rodriguez. It's not a sudden loss of control. It's the final act of dominion, the ultimate exercise of power and control. Our sentencing should reflect that reality. The case also influenced how medical professionals approach potential poisoning cases. Dr. Sarah Chin, who'd first identified the antifreeze poisoning in Miriam's system, became an advocate for better training in recognizing toxic exposure. Antifreeze poisoning mimics so many other conditions: flu, kidney disease, metabolic disorders, Dr. Chin explained at a medical conference in 2000. We almost missed it with Miriam Holt. If I hadn't ordered that specific tox screen, her death might have been ruled natural causes, and Raymond would have gotten away with murder. We need to train emergency physicians to consider poisoning in cases of unexplained illness, particularly when there's a history of domestic conflict. Hospitals began implementing protocols for screening domestic violence victims for signs of poisoning or other covert harm. Emergency rooms posted information about poisoning symptoms and resources for victims of abuse. Tessa Groves, Raymond's former mistress, struggled with guilt and shame for years after the trial. She'd moved away from Macon immediately after testifying, trying to escape the scandal and the judgment. In 2005, she published a memoir titled, The Pastor's Other Woman, My Affair with a Killer. The book was controversial. Some felt she was exploiting Miriam's death for profit, while others saw it as a cautionary tale about how abusers manipulate everyone around them, not just their victims. In the book, Tessa wrote, I was 26 and naive. I believed everything Raymond told me, that his marriage was dead, that Miriam was cold and unloving, that he and I had a special connection. I see now that I was just a tool he used, first to gratify his ego and later to hurt Miriam. He didn't love me any more than he loved her. We were both just objects to him, things he could use and discard. The difference is that I survived. Miriam didn't. Tessa used the proceeds from the book to establish a scholarship fund for women pursuing degrees in counseling or social work. I can't undo my role in what happened, she wrote. But maybe I can help train people who will recognize abuse and help victims before it's too late. Grace Covenant Church, under new leadership, gradually rebuilt. They removed all photographs and plaques honoring Raymond Holt. They renamed the education wing, which had been called the Holt Fellowship Hall. Pastor Linda Chin, who'd taken over leadership in 1998, worked to create a different culture. We talk openly about abuse now, she explained. We teach that submission is mutual, that marriage is a partnership, that no one, male or female, should tolerate violence or control. We've had members disclose abuse they suffered years ago, during Raymond's tenure, abuse they were too ashamed to mention because Raymond's teachings made them feel it was their fault. We're working to heal that damage. The church also established a crisis fund to help members escape abusive situations. Money for security deposits on apartments, for legal fees, for emergency travel if someone needed to flee quickly. Miriam stayed partly because she didn't think she had options, Pastor Chin said. We're making sure other women know they have options, that this church will help them get to safety. In the academic world, the Holt case became a standard study in criminology, psychology, and theology courses. Students analyzed Raymond's psychology, the narcissism, the need for control, the ability to compartmentalize his public persona from his private cruelty. They studied Miriam's response, why she stayed so long, why she struggled to believe her husband was poisoning her even as evidence mounted, how abuse warps victims' ability to trust their own perceptions. They examined the role of religion in enabling abuse, how theological concepts of submission and headship can be twisted into justifications for control, how churches can inadvertently protect abusers by prioritizing reconciliation over accountability. The Holt case is a perfect storm of risk factors, explained Dr. Julia Manning, who teaches domestic violence psychology. You have a power imbalance reinforced by religious ideology. You have a victim who's been systematically isolated and had her self-worth destroyed. You have a community that sees the abuser as a moral authority. And you have a culture that pressures women to stay in marriages at all costs. Understanding how these factors interact helps us identify and intervene in similar situations. For Miriam's extended family, the healing has been slow and incomplete. Claire Davidson never recovered from her sister's death or from what she sees as the inadequacy of Raymond's sentence. She developed health problems, high blood pressure, anxiety, depression, that she directly attributes to the stress of Miriam's murder and the trial. I lost my sister twice, Claire said in a 2015 interview. Once when Raymond killed her, and again when the justice system told me her life was only worth 28 years. I'll never understand that. I'll never accept it. Miriam's friends from church, particularly those who'd sensed something was wrong but didn't intervene, have struggled with guilt. I saw the bruises on her arms once, confessed Martha Reynolds, who'd known Miriam for a decade. I asked about them and she said she'd bumped into a door. I knew that was probably a lie. But I didn't push. I didn't want to be intrusive. I didn't want to believe that Pastor Holt, who preached such beautiful sermons about love, could be hurting his wife. I chose to look away. And Miriam paid the price for my cowardice. Several of Miriam's friends became volunteers with the Miriam Holt Foundation, channeling their guilt and grief into helping other victims. We can't save Miriam, Martha said. But we can save the next woman. We can be the people who don't look away, who do ask the hard questions, who do believe victims when they tell us they're in danger. As Raymond Holt approaches the end of his life in prison, his legacy is one of manipulation, cruelty, and the ultimate betrayal of trust. He took the pulpit meant for spiritual guidance and used it to justify abuse. He took the role of husband meant for partnership and twisted it into dictatorship. He took a woman who trusted him and slowly, deliberately killed her. His church is rebuilding without him. His victims have found their voices. And Miriam, though gone, is remembered not as Raymond's possession but as her own person. A woman who endured, who tried to escape, whose death sparked changes that may save others. Raymond once told Miriam, "I made you who you are." But in the end, Miriam's true self, her kindness, her faith, her desperate courage in trying to break free, emerged despite him, not because of him. And her legacy lives on in the foundation bearing her name, in the women it helps, in the conversations it sparked. Raymond didn't make Miriam who she was. He tried to destroy who she was. And in that, ultimately, he failed. What can we learn from Miriam's story? How can we better support people trapped in abusive relationships? What responsibility do religious communities have to confront teachings that enable abuse? These questions matter because cases like Miriam's continue to happen. Share your thoughts in the comments, and please subscribe to our channel to stay informed about cases that reveal uncomfortable truths about justice, power, and the vulnerability of those we should protect most. Thank you for bearing witness to Miriam's story. May her memory continue to inspire change, and may we never forget that behind every statistic, every case file, every court ruling, is a human being who deserved better.